So I said I would send a video on core training, basically an advanced core training routine, and I'm actually probably not going to show you an advanced core training routine. I'm going to show you a bunch of different core training ideas. So when we think about core training, we basically going to think about three things. One is anti-extension. So the muscles in the front of you, their job is to keep you from getting extended. You know, if you can imagine, to keep you from being in this really lordotic back position. When we look at side bending, I think we used to always see this sort of side-to-side action and then think, okay, side to side. Nope. What we've got to think about now is that these muscles' job is really to prevent you from side bending. So we've got to look at this anti-lateral flexion. And then the last thing we've got to think about is anti-rotation. And when we think about the anti-extension, we're going to show you how anti-extension becomes anti-rotation, and then we're going to show you 3 or 4 anti-rotation exercises. So we'll start with this anti-extension idea. The simplest thing from an anti-extension standpoint, obviously, is a plank. What are we doing when we get in a plank position? We're just here, and we're using our core musculature, obviously in a really static way, to keep us from extending. So we can think about that as anterior core. We can look at the sort of six-pack rectus abdominis idea. When we say, okay, how do we progress that? Well, the easiest way to progress it, we'll go to what we call a stability ball rollout, because what am I doing when I do this is I'm really taking that same exercise. It's really just a moving plank. So I've got a plank, and I'm now lengthening and shortening the lever, so I'm applying more extension force, less extension force. So we can look at that and think, all right, anti-extension with some motion. Now we can look at anti-extension and say, how do I combine anti-extension and anti-rotation? If I go to here and I think now I'm going to do some sort of plank reaching exercise, I've now taken that same anti-extension exercise and I've made it an anti-rotation exercise and an anti-rotation exercise. So now I've got both, because now I've got one segment that still has got to prevent me from going into extension, and then I've got to use my diagonal capability to keep myself from rotating. With that anti-extension and rotation, I can do things, you know, what people call renegade rows, plank rows, where I could have dumbbells. I could do what we call clock planks, where I'm working my way around, say, a clock face situation. In that situation, obviously I'm getting a bigger scapulothoracic component, but I'm also being able to use this anti-extension and anti-rotation component of both of those exercises. So that's a kind of quick overview when I think about anti-extension, anti-rotation. Now we look at anti-lateral flexion. Where do we go? Same idea, right? We start looking side plank. Here's my basic anti-lateral flexion exercise. Again, a really simple, static, nothing too complicated about that, right? But then I say, okay, how do I want to make that more complicated? Simplest way to make that more complicated is to take some sort of cable apparatus and add, if we're going to look at this in the simplest sense, we want to add some perturbation. We want to try to pull me out of position. So now suddenly what do I have? Side plank row. So now I'm in this position, and now I'm rowing, because obviously that row is trying to pull me. It's applying a rotational force. So now I've taken my anti-lateral flexion exercise, I've added an anti-rotation component to it by getting involved in the row. When I want to take that same exercise and say, okay, now how do I make that even more functional, as much as I'm hesitant to use the word functional, I can simply go grab a dumbbell, grab a kettlebell, and I can walk. Because now when I have that suitcase carry, walking, holding something heavy in my hand, what do I got? Anti-lateral flexion again, now also combined with some anti-rotation stuff. So what you start to realize is that you've got anti-extension, you've got anti-lateral flexion, but you start adding in components of anti-rotation all the time. The third thing is sort of the straight-up anti-rotation idea. When we think about the simplest anti-rotation exercise, then we can look at what we would call an anti-rotation press, or if we want to give him any credit at all, Palloff press, because this really is John Palloff's idea. But so here we just go to a tall kneeling position, and then we simply lengthen and shorten the lever. Obviously here, there's a rotary force. I don't want to be doing stuff like this. That's not what I want. We're thinking anti-rotation. Rotary force here is fairly low. Rotary force here is higher. Low, high, low, high. Really simple, right? That's a simple anti-rotation exercise. We can then take that same concept and we can add a little bit of Gray Cook's thought process to this and say, now let's make it a chop exercise or a lift exercise. When we start thinking about a lift exercise, we're talking about a diagonal pattern from low to high. And here, what we like to think about, we'd like to get somebody in line on a balance beam, and I want to get them to think pull, press, pull, press. And again, anti-rotation, because where's my force? My force is trying to pull me into that machine. It's trying to rotate me. I've got to use my glutes, my core, my hips to create that stability. Then I'm going to bring that load diagonally through my body. The reverse of that, chop pattern. Same idea. Sorry, same idea in terms of being in line. Make sure we get that. Here, now we've got the same idea. It's a pull into a push. But again, now we're talking here we've got diagonal high to low. Here we've got diagonal low to high. At this level, we've got sort of a straight transverse plane diagonal. Those would be your base anti-rotation stuff. So when you start thinking about core training, you've got to think anti-extension, you've got to think anti-lateral flexion, and then you've got to think anti-rotation, and then you've got to think about how to progress those.